Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories Podcast, the show for and about those of us who are sat quietly in libraries, archives, and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin. I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this episode, The Valiant, we'll be hearing about a man whose relationship with fire leads him to bravery. And then we'll be looking for a 17th century couple on the borders of modern-day Netherlands and Belgium. So, put down that old microfiche, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a professional genealogist from the Netherlands who spent many years working in Tilburg archives. His dedication and enthusiasm for local history and genealogy saw him made a Knight in the Order of Orange-Nassau in 2018. In addition to this, he's also served as a board member of APG, that's the Association of Professional Genealogists, and he's a member of a raft of international and Dutch genealogical societies. So, before I ramble any further, and this night turns into day again, let's meet our guest. It's John Boeren. Hello, John. Welcome to the Family Histories Podcast.
Hello, Andrew. What a lovely day to be here. I'm very happy, very pleased to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We always start with the same first question, and that is, what first interested you in researching your family history?
I was kind of expecting this question, so I thought for a while over the last few days, because I always tell people that it started in 1988, and now I think it started actually 4 years before that, in 1984, when here in the Netherlands we were commemorating the fact that our, let's say, founding father, William of Orange, was shot in 1584. And because that was 400 years later, there were a lot of publications and there was a TV show and there were so many events all focusing on that moment. Yeah. And I started to read about William of Orange a lot. But when reading about these, let's say, noble families, you always get a family tree.
Yeah.
Because, you have Henry VIII with his 6 wives. We have William of Orange with 4 wives and with children from every marriage. So it's rather complicated to understand which child is born when and from which marriage and so on. So you get this family tree. And I think that was really the start of my interest in family trees as a kind of help to understand the national and international history. So I also saw family trees for the French kings and the English kings and the German emperors. And I think that was the first spark.
Okay.
And then 1988, the year they always mention, is when the youngest brother of my grandfather told me that he had a call from someone with the same surname asking him about his family, because the man who called him wanted to know whether they were related or not.
Right, okay.
So my great uncle started to talk about his parents and his uncles and aunts. And I think because I was interested in history and I had seen these family trees from all those noble families, that was the moment I thought, can I have one of my own? So that was January 88. I was 14 and a bit years old. And then I think in October of that year, I visited the Tilburg archives for the very first time. And that's how it all started. From that moment on, I was caught by the virus, and I've been doing genealogy from that moment on.
Do you think that having seen all these kind of royal and noble family trees, were you maybe looking to see if maybe you could connect those, or were you simply, I like these trees, I want one for my family because my family is great too?
Well, I was actually working with those trees. So I never had the illusion that I was related to any of them.
Right, okay.
I knew for sure that I was from a rather ordinary family who worked in the textile industry here in Tilburg. So there was no aspiration of being of noble descent. But I did play around with connecting these trees because as we all know, all these royal families are related in 520 times.
Yes.
So I did play with that. But the idea of going to an archive was quite a step. Reading a book is one thing, but then as a young boy, as I said, by then I was 15 years old, going to an archive and saying, "Hi, I want to know more about my family history." Nowadays, it's more common, but in 1988, it was still a unique situation for the archives to have such a young person coming in and saying, "I want to see all your old books because I want to know more about my family."
Yeah. So what sort of records did you start researching with?
Well, the interesting fact is that probably the archive staff had no idea what to do with me, such a young person. Maybe they were even convinced that I was not very serious in doing this research. So they gave me some books with copies of birth, marriage, and death records. And they were more like, here's a table, here's a book, do your thing.
Oh, okay.
So that's how it started, just going through copies of BMD records, trying to figure out who I had the names of my great grandparents. And, I started to look for their records. And I was convinced that my family was from Tilburg for a very long time. But actually, I already found out that the father of my great grandfather was born in another place. So that was a little bit disappointing. The very first day you're in the archives, and then you find out, oh, wait a moment, we're not that much from Tilburg as we always thought we were.
Yeah.
So that's how it started. And by then, we're talking about the late 80s. We did have microfiche, we did have microfilm, we had copies. Of course, there was no computer, there was no internet at all. So it was more or less just going through books and copies of books, trying to find the right records.
So did you have any family documents back at home? Did you have lots of photographs and certificates for things?
Unfortunately, no.
Right.
When I talked to my father about his family, he was like, I don't know much about them. And I also figured out that maybe that was because my grandfather had 4 siblings and they were not close. So my father didn't know his cousins. He had a few stories about his grandparents, but not much. And there were a couple of photos, but there was not a lot. The only thing that I did get through my father, which was quite interesting, was a letter from a notary from, I believe, the late 1960s. Because when one of the younger siblings of my great-grandfather died, he was single at the time of his death, and he died without a will. So there was a notary looking for all the heirs, and then after a while they had to divide the estate. So there was a letter from the notary saying, these are all the people who have a claim on the estate, which was quite interesting because now I had names and I had dates of birth. I had addresses from the 1960s. So that was a very valuable document for my family history.
Nice.
But I'm not from a family with a lot of documents, a lot of photographs. So yeah, I just have to make the best of it.
And so making the best of it you have done for your own research, but of course you've become a professional genealogist as well. How did you end up thinking, I want to do this for other people and for money?
Well, I worked, as you already said in the introduction, in the archives for a few years. So working with other people on their own family trees was part of my work for a couple of years.
Sure.
And then I took a turn and my career went in a complete different direction. I worked for the local government for 20 plus years. And then there is a moment in your life, and in my case, it was in my mid-40s, when you're thinking like, I've been doing this for more than 20 years now. I have another 20 years to go before I retire. Is this what I want to do for the next 20 years? Yeah. Or maybe is there something else that I would like to do? So that was the moment when I started to think about, could genealogy be more than just an interesting hobby? So I talked with a few people, and in 2015, I decided to start my own business and just to see how it would develop. I had no intention of becoming a full-time professional genealogist because I was rather convinced that it would not bring enough money to live from genealogy alone. So I started to work a few hours less, and I started to work on genealogy. And that's how it started exactly 10 years ago. 3 years later, I found out that I was working many hours in total. I still had my old job.
Yeah.
I was doing genealogy already for many clients. And I was like, whoa, I'm working 60 hours a week. Is this what I signed up for? Or do I really want to make a choice now and focus on one of these things? So I talked to my employer, and he was like, I think this is a great opportunity for you. So I hate to see you go, but at the same time, I think this is the thing you should really pursue. And that was in 2018. And then I gave up my job and I started to work full time as a genealogist. And I can only say that it was one of the best decisions of my life.
How important was genealogical study in your decision to become a professional? Did you think, I need to get a lot of qualifications in this topic, or was that not as important?
Well, I definitely wanted to have some kind of education. I studied law when I was in my 20s. And, law is also a very helpful study if you do genealogy, because there are so many legal documents and all kinds of legal actions that people take. But I never had a background in history or something like that. So when I started to work as a genealogist, I wanted to have some kind of education. But at the same time, I also realized that here in the Netherlands, there is nothing of a sort like that. So I started to look around. I first signed up for classes from what's nowadays called the International Institute for Genealogical Studies, which was in Canada and now is in the US. And then in 2020, I got this crazy idea that maybe I should do the Strathclyde program. So I enrolled in October 2020, and I'm now in the midst of writing my dissertation, which is sometimes driving me crazy. But at the same time, it's also, it's working to that summit where everything comes together. Yeah. So for the last 5 years for Strathclyde, and then a few years before, I did work on genealogical education. And people always ask me, did you really learn a lot that you can use actually for your work when you're working for clients? And it's a mixed answer, because I could do genealogy and research before I started Strathclyde, of course. But at the same time, you develop some skills that are different, like thinking critically, writing in a different way. So yeah, it was very helpful in the end.
Yeah, I bet it was. Now, it would be hard, obviously, to talk about the Netherlands and not mention the Dutch colonial empire. Mm-hmm. And obviously that has had an impact on many countries around the world. How has that impacted your research? Do you have lots of clients from overseas?
Well, actually, I think 80% of my client base is from abroad.
Right, okay.
For two reasons. First of all, the Dutch people can rather do their own genealogy very well. A lot of archives have digitized the most important records. Mm-hmm. So for those people, it's not too complicated to do their own research. And I always think, let them, it's a hobby for a lot of people. So let them spend a lot of hours, a lot of years on their own tree.
Yeah, sure.
On the other hand, we have a lot of people who are descendants of immigrants from the Netherlands. Yeah. People who left the Netherlands already in the 1600s to go, for example, to New Amsterdam.
Which is sort of lower Manhattan in today's New York. Yeah.
But also people from the 19th century, when we had quite a lot of people, especially from the northern part of the country, migrating to the United States, for example. And later on, we had people who went to Australia. So there are a lot of people in the world who are a descendant of someone who once left the Netherlands. And those people who are now generation after generation in the United States or in Australia, they need help simply because they don't speak Dutch. Often they can't read the handwriting, but it's also the Dutch language that is quite difficult for them to understand, of course. And that's where most of my clients are asking me to help them. Sometimes they have done research by just going through a database and finding names and dates. But if they really dig deeper and really find records written in the Dutch language in an old handwriting, then they are like, I have no idea what this is about, so can you help me? So that's why people ask me to help them. And I also found that well, especially the last years, there are a lot of people who first develop some kind of interest in their own family history and then want to go to the Netherlands to see where the people actually lived. So that's also another thing that I rather like over the real research is taking people to these places and really connect them to their Dutch heritage by sometimes just standing in a field of grass and there is nothing else, but you can say here in 1850 was a farm where your family lived for quite some time. And although there is nothing left from this farm, it's still a place that triggers emotions. And I think that's invaluable. It's at the end of the day, I always say I'm happy that they pay the bill, but seeing them experiencing all these emotions when they are seeing, a grave or be in the church where family was baptized or being in that field where once a farm stood, it triggers so many emotions. And the fact that I was able to connect them and to give them these feelings and to give them an idea of this is where my family actually came from, that's even more important than just someone paying a bill.
Definitely. I love visiting places that are key to my family's history. You can certainly kind of feel that connection, even if there's nothing left from their time.
Yep.
As I mentioned in the introduction, in 2018, you were made a Knight in the Order of Orange Nassau. How did that come about? And how did you find out that this was happening?
Well, actually, it's a bit similar as your Order of the British Empire, the MBEs and the OBEs you have.
Yeah.
This is similar to that. It's a different order, so we have different grades. But you can compare my knighthood with, I think, an OBE in the UK.
Okay.
I think the same as you have in the UK, there is a moment when the king decides that some people get a knighthood or something like that. And I have to be more precise here. I'm not a knight in a way that you can call me sir. We have different grades in this whole order. And I'm not the lowest, I'm the second from below. So it's not like it's a huge honor and you don't have to call me Sir John, which I do appreciate if you do, by the way. But
yes, Sir John.
Yes. No, but it's a way of society expressing gratitude for what you do for society. So in my case, it was because of a lot of volunteer work on all kinds of boards of societies and foundations that in 2018, the king decided to grant me this knighthood. And it's always a ceremony that there are local ceremonies. So the mayor is the one who acts on behalf of the king, giving you the insignia that are part of this knighthood. And it's always a ceremony where most people who are there because they are awarded something have no idea what's happening. So in my case, it was quite interesting because it used to be my work for many years to assist the mayor with everything that had to do with giving people this award. And not knowing that one day I was one of the lucky people as well. It was a terrible situation though, because I became sick. And sick in a way that I could not be there. But my family knew, of course, that something was about to happen with me that day. So they pushed me. Like, no, you have to go. You worked on this for such a long time, so you should be there. And even though you cannot really help the mayor, be in the audience and so on. So here I was sitting in the theater, feeling sick. And then the mayor said, he mentioned a number of people that would be awarded. And I was like, that's one too many. He's making a mistake. Not knowing, of course, that secretly people had been working on my case. And then he called my name and I was like, oh no, they tricked me like we tricked everybody else for so many years. And now I am the victim. But of course, it's a huge honor. People who were on board with me, who worked with me, apparently appreciated the things that I've done. And I'm very humble, but also very pleased, very honored that this happened.
Do you get any little free perks like free parking or unlimited photographs in the archives or something like that?
No, I think most people in the archives have no idea that. But the only thing which is quite nice, is every day on the king's birthday, here in our city, in the theater, is a concert. And everyone who is awarded one of these knighthoods or whatever it is invited to come and celebrate the king's birthday in this concert and having a drink afterwards. So that's the only thing you get, other than just a nice ribbon on your coat.
Family history is far more than just collecting a bunch of names, dates and places. It's all the fascinating little bits in between that come together to form these stories. And sometimes those stories can be just as unexpected as they are fascinating. With that in mind, it's now time for my guest to pick one of their relatives and tell their life story. So John, who are you going to introduce us to?
Right, so I've been thinking about who in my family would be very interesting to talk about. And there are, of course, a lot of people you can tell stories about. I picked one because previously I already said that clients often are triggered by their own family history to visit places. And this is also what happened with my ancestor that I want to talk about, because this ancestor brought me to a place to actually, experience what it is to be in his footsteps.
Right.
So I want to tell you the story of Maarten van Leeuwen, who is the grandfather of my grandmother's grandmother. So in other words, my grandmother, Martha, had a grandmother who was also called Martha, and Martha had a grandfather who was called Maarten.
Right, okay. Gotcha.
We're talking about him today. And it started when I was browsing through some books, publications, to find, these little bits and pieces of your family, just a name with something extra. Yeah. And there was a book about militia in the village where he lived. And this militia, and we still have these nowadays, were no longer involved in protecting society, but they became more like a brotherhood.
Okay.
And every year or 2 years or 3 years, they would have a competition, because in the past, militia had a weapon. Some had a rifle, some had a bow, if they were very old. And in the 19th century, they were no longer using weapons to protect the society, but they were using them for sports, for competition. And I found one of the prizes that was given to Maarten in 1825 when he won a competition like that. Okay. And it was a silver shield, a small shield with some engravings. And the interesting thing is that there was a picture of a round medal with the front side and the back side. And there was his name, Maarten van Leeuwen. And there were a few lines. Now, the first 4 lines triggered me because it's written in Dutch. But if you translate it in English, it says, "As I have done my services as a faithful hero, and have endured everything for the Dutch line, bloody, 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 blah." This is 1825, when he won this competition and he got this silver shield with this engraving. And the medal, but also those 4 lines, triggered my curiosity, because I was like, why is there a medal on this plate? And what does Dutch lion and faithful hero have to do with him?
Yep. Hero is quite a word that grabs a lot of attention.
Of course, absolutely. But also that Dutch lion, because you mentioned the Order of Orange-Nassau, which I'm a knight of. We have another order, a royal order, which is the Order of the Dutch Lion.
Right.
So when I saw the medal and I read the words Dutch Lion, I was like, wait a moment. Was he a member of this royal order? And if so, why? So I started to find out whether he actually belonged to this royal order or not. So the round medal that is in this silver plate has the Latin words Virtus Nobilitat, which means virtue and nobles. Now, that is the motto of this royal order.
Right.
So there were some indications that he had something with his royal order. The thing is, if you look for more information about the royal order, you find out that the insignia are not a round medal, but they are a cross. So I was a little bit like, okay, it's not a cross, so he was not a knight in the Order of the Dutch Lion, but what then? And then I found out that there was a special class, and if you read the words from 1815, I think they are quite interesting, if I can use that word, because when this order was established in 1815, there was a special class, and I will now quote, for worthy persons in whom the needs and cares connected with the lower orders of society have not extinguished the noble fire of human love.
Wow.
So what they actually said is the cross is for the better class people, and we have created something extra, like a round medal, for the lower class people,
Right.
who apparently are worthy enough to get a distinction like this because they did something. Now, the interesting fact is also because these medals were awarded to the lower class people, there was also a pension connected to an award like this, which, of course, for people who were not wealthy, was quite a thing.
Yeah.
And it was 200 guilders per year. That was quite a pension for people who just were lower class. So in 1815, this medal was established. And then in 1825, apparently my ancestor, Martin, got one. So what happened between 1815 and 1825 that he got this award? Now, to understand what happened is we go a little bit back in time because we want to know more about Martin, of course. He was born in 1795 in a small village near Gouda. You know, the place where the cheese is named after?
I know that well.
Yes. So Martin was born there, and when he was 14 years old, he enlisted for military service. Now, these young boys often ended up as the first mate of sailors on a boat or something like that, because they were too young to actually be in the army and fight.
Yeah, sure.
But they could do some tasks on the boat. So for 5 years he was on the boat. In 1814 he became a soldier, and he became part of a artillery battalion, and he was working as a gunner, second class. So he was operating a cannon.
Okay. Yep.
In 1816, he was promoted to a gunner first class. Now, we're talking about 1809, 1814. These are the Napoleonic times, when the Netherlands, as we know it nowadays, was part of the French Empire.
Yep.
And 1813 is, of course, already the first attempt to get rid of Napoleon. And then in 1815, we had the final battle. So in these times, he was in the army.
Yes.
And this is also the reason why he became one of the Waterloo heroes. Waterloo, we all know, not only from ABBA with their song, but of course, as historians, we know a lot about the Battle of Waterloo. So he became a soldier in 1814, and it's quite interesting that when he enlisted, there was also a physical description.
Nice.
So we got a little bit to know what he looked like. It said that he had an oval-shaped face, an oval-shaped forehead, blue eyes, a medium nose, a small mouth, a pointy chin, blonde hair and brown eyebrows. And, also very interesting, he had some burn marks on his right leg. Now, I can imagine that if you have been on a boat for a long time, there is always something maybe with fire that caused these marks. So in 1814, he becomes a soldier. And then, of course, it's 1815. And we have Waterloo, and we have the Duke of Wellington. And the Duke of Wellington was assisted by the Crown Prince of the Netherlands, William. So there were also a lot of Dutch troops fighting with Wellington and his army against Napoleon.
Okay, yeah.
Now, one of these battalions was commanded by Captain Lux. There were 262 men in this battalion, And the battalion was in a small place in what's nowadays the French-speaking part of Belgium. And then it's June 1815, we have the Battle of Waterloo, and his captain, either he was stubborn or he was afraid, but he did not follow orders.
Okay.
So his battalion stayed behind instead of marching like his orders were. And I don't know, this is speculating, but maybe this was a wise decision from his side, because we all know how many people died in the Battle of Waterloo. So if this battalion would have marched towards the real, front line, maybe Martin would have died there in the battle. So they stayed behind. He was part of the battle or not, but there was, in all the records, I could not find anything hero-like that would ever have been a reason to give him this medal. Actually, if his captain was not following orders, that would be the opposite of being a hero.
Yes.
So here I was looking at his military records and I was like, no heroism because of the Battle of Waterloo. He was there, but... And then I found out that after the Battle of Waterloo, the battalion stayed in nowadays French-speaking Belgium, so the Walloon area, and they marched from one place to another. And then in 1817, they were in a small city called Ath. And nowadays there are 30,000 inhabitants, but of course in 1817 it was obviously a very small place. And in the middle of this city, small city, there was the parish church dedicated to Saint-Julien, and it was built in 1414, so quite an old church. And we're now in April 1817, 2 years after Waterloo, and there is a storm, and there is thunder and lightning. And lightning and church towers are not a lucky combination.
No.
So what happens? Yes, lightning strikes the tower, and there is a fire. So here is a group of young soldiers in this place at the time when the church is on fire. So Martin is asking his captain whether it's okay to help extinguishing the fire. So he climbs on the roof of the church and is trying to throw away all these burning pieces of wood from the roof.
Wow.
And he has some kind of hose to extinguish the fire with some water.
Yeah.
Then it's almost like a movie. A big piece of wood comes down, hits him, and he falls from the roof 65 meters below on the ground. And actually, most people at that time believed that he was dead.
Yeah, not many people would survive that fall.
The Dutch government gazette wrote on the 15th of April 1817, a brave soldier lost his life. Now, actually, he didn't die.
Oh.
He was carried away. He was brought to a hospital, and he was in hospital for a couple of weeks, but he recovered. And that's the moment when, for some reason, probably triggered by his captain or someone else, he wrote a letter to the king. And he said, "Dear King, this is what happened to me. I was in Waterloo. I was here in this place. I fell from the church, and I now have problems with walking. So I fear that working for the rest of my life is going to be very complicated, and that could also have an impact on my income." That's just a request. And then the king decides to award him this medal, plus that pension of 200 guilders per year. So it was not, the medal was nice, but I think he needed the pension of 200 guilders because he had some physical disabilities that probably made it difficult for him to work the rest of his life. So this is what happened in 1817, and that's why he was awarded this medal. Now then, you may think, okay, great story, that's it. But no, in 1819, so 2 years after this incident, his military career comes to an end. And he goes to this small village just north of the city of Tilburg, where he starts a new career. He becomes a shoemaker. Now, that's not weird because a lot of people in this area are shoemakers. They're in the shoe industry.
Yeah, sure.
He gets married in 1825 and 8 children are born. And they live in the middle of this village. Fast forward 1858, so we're now like 35 years later. There is a fire in the village center and his house burns down. That's the second time he gets, fire gets into his life.
Yeah.
Or maybe the third time, if we also knew already that he had marks on his leg from some fire when he was on that ship as a young sailor. Yeah. Anyway, in 1858, he's confronted with a fire in his house. But a year later, in 1859, guess what? Lightning church tower in his own village. So there is again a fire, but now not in this Belgian place, but in his own village where he lived already for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And there is again a fire in the church. And then the newspapers say that he took off his hat, his coat, and his wooden shoes, and he climbed in the church tower. Halfway the spire, he could go through an opening to get outside, on the outside of the spire, and he tried to extinguish the fire from there. This time he did not fall down, so no accident at all, but yes, he was successful. And then he got another medal for this in 1860. And then to make the whole story complete, in 1865, when it was 50 years after Waterloo, the King William III, established a medal, an award for all these heroes who fought at Waterloo. Of course, a lot already died in those 50 years.
By that time, yeah.
Yeah, but Maarten was still alive, so he received a third medal as a kind of commemoration of 50 years Waterloo. So by the end of his life, and he was a very old man because he was in his 90s when he died, he actually had 3 medals. The round medal that was on the silver plate because he was a brother in the Order of the Dutch Lion. And then this bronze medal because of the fire in the village. And then another one to commemorate Waterloo 50 years later. So he was a true hero. And when he died in 1889, he was 94 years old. There were a lot of newspaper articles about this person who died, who was a hero. And it's so interesting to read these articles because they give you not only some of the facts, and we all know that if you compare the true facts with newspaper articles, there are always discrepancies.
Yeah.
Also in this situation, but most of the line in these the storyline in these articles are okay. That's interesting, but it's also the way they were writing about how the people reacted. A person like this on the things he did, being a hero, being old, because 94 years in 1887 was also an accomplishment already in itself.
Yeah, definitely.
And he was married for more than 60 years. So these were all things that accumulated in these newspaper articles. And it's really amazing to read all these stories about one of your ancestors. Having found all this information, I shared it with the local historical society. And a few years later, when the municipality was looking for names for, there was a new part of the village created, and there were new streets, and they needed names for the streets. And they wanted to have a few names of people from the village who had an interesting career or were important or whatever.
Sure.
And the local historical society also nominated Maarten. And nowadays there is a street named after him. So that made me very proud to see that my research, not because it's my ancestor, but my research helped people in the village understand who this person was, what he did in their own village, but also in other places.
Yeah.
And that they found that to be important enough to nominate him for naming a street after him. So now we have a street in the village named after Maarten van Leeuwen, which I think is quite nice.
Wow, that is really nice, but please tell me that there is a fire station on that street.
No, there is not.
Oh,
But
no.
maybe one day they can think about that. Yes.
Well, if they're listening, perhaps you ought to put a fire station on that street, I think. But that is quite a remarkable story. And
Absolutely.
to survive that first fall, that is just remarkable.
Yeah.
And it's great that he had such a long life as well.
Apparently, the fall maybe made him disabled in a way, but it definitely did not kill him because he lived for many years later.
No, and it certainly didn't dampen his determination as well.
Nope. So yeah, it's. I would have loved to see a photo of this man. You know, he died in 1889. So actually, it is possible
Yeah.
that a hero like this, with all the medals on his breast, would have been in a photograph. I've never found one. Nobody else ever did. Yeah, that's a shame.
Well, I hope a photograph turns up because I would love to see a picture of him as well. So,
Yep.
wow. Well, thank you, John, for sharing the story of Maarten van Leeuwen. But it's now time for you to face
the brick wall.
Brick walls are thoroughly annoying, but somehow they're also wonderfully compelling too, keeping us researching for days, weeks, years and beyond as we try to break through. It's now time for my guests to share one of their brick walls in a hope that one of you, dear listeners, can help with a clue or a research idea. Okay, John, how can we help?
Well, as I told you in the beginning, I started with my family in 1988. And of course, I focused on the family that I am part of with my surname, Boeren, which, by the way, in English means farmers.
Okay.
So the line goes from the city I still live in to a smaller place, and then we crossed the border with Belgium. Now, we're going back generation after generation until the 1660s.
Right.
By then, we already have borders like we have now, because in 1648, with the peace treaty in Münster, there was a border between the north and the south in the Netherlands. So actually, my family lived on the other side of the border, and this makes it a little bit complicated. So what did I find is there were three brothers who were born in the 1660s.
Okay.
I found their baptism records, and I know that they had, of course, a father and a mother. I found those names as well because they are in the baptism records. I also found death records for both parents, and interestingly, they were buried in the village church.
Yeah.
The grave is still there, so you can imagine that I was beyond control almost when I found out that I could actually still visit a place to see their grave.
For such an old grave as well.
Yep, because they were, if I say correctly, they were buried in 1687 and 1688. So we're talking about a grave from the 1680s, and it's still there. You can still see what's written on it. So I'm looking for these two people. So it's Jacob and Joan, if I would say that in English. They did not have the surname Boeren yet.
Okay.
What we see a lot in my area is that surnames, of course, there were families who already had a fixed surname in the 1400s, but most ordinary families in my part of the country, and also on the other side of the border in what's nowadays Belgium, not always had a fixed surname yet. So especially by the end of the 17th century, there were still a lot of people who were using patronymics.
Right.
So that also was the case with Jacob. Jacob was named after his father, HENDRIKX. So Jacob HENDRIKX was Jacob, the son of Hendrik. That's what I know.
Yeah, right.
He got married with Joan, and I know that she was a daughter of a very interesting first name, HEIJLIGER, which, if you translate that into English, would mean holier. So I do know the first names of the parents through their patronymics, but I cannot find a baptism for the husband, and I cannot find a baptism for the wife, and I cannot find a marriage for both of them. So I do have three boys being born in the 1660s, but there is no marriage record and there are no baptism records for those two people.
Right, okay.
Of course, the first thing I did was looking around in the same village, whether there were parish registers with names that look alike, because the surname Boeren was not there, but I was like, okay, look for patronymics, look for first names that are similar, maybe with different patronymics or a different surname or a nickname or whatever. Nothing. Now, the problem with Jacob is that Jacob is a very common name and Hendrik is a very common name. So it's rather difficult to find out who is who. But with his wife, whose father was named HEIJLIGER, which is a very uncommon name, you would assume that it is easier to find that family.
Yeah.
Now, I did find a family of her that could be her parents and siblings. I did find baptisms for possible siblings, but not hers. So first, of course, I checked all the parish registers from the same parish, from parishes in the neighborhood. I also crossed the border again to go back to the Dutch side of it, because it appears that her family came from the other side of the border, which is in current day Netherlands again. Try to figure some information there. Maybe found the family, but not her baptism or whatever. So that's the first step, was of course going through parish registers and see if I could find anything in the neighborhood. The problem is, as if I have a marriage record, then maybe it says where they were from. So far I didn't find that marriage, which is quite interesting, because in the whole area there are marriage registers for, let's say, 1659 or something like that. So they do exist, but not theirs. It's not their marriage is not recorded. I cannot find it, at least.
Yeah, that's frustrating.
Now, I may have found his baptism, but I'm not sure. So then I started to go through all the other sources, like local court records, notarial records, everything like that. And I can find a lot from 1660 on, but not before. And I've been looking for this family now already, well, maybe not 1988, but let's say 1989 or 1990. So we're now talking about 35 years that I've been looking for their marriage record and their baptisms. And although I've seen so many parish registers from the area, and one would expect them to be in those parish registers, they are not their marriage and not their baptism. So that's my brick wall already for a long time. And, there is a hypothesis that he belongs to this family and she belongs to that family, but without proper evidence, I cannot link them to the right family. So for 35 years, my line ends with Jacob, which is also the first person not using the surname Boeren. So in a way, it is symbolic that it ends with him. But obviously, I would very much like to find more about his family, or even her family, but especially his family, because that's my patrilineal descent. So we're talking about an area that is partly Dutch and partly Belgian. That already complicates things. Another thing is that whereas in the Netherlands, archives digitize and index a lot, in Belgium, they are not that far as we are on this side of the border. So finding records online is quite complicated. I've been, of course, to archives to just go through the original books.
Yeah.
But if you have a book with 500 pages and you have to go through them page by page without an index in the 1650s, 1660s, in the terrible handwriting, it takes a lot of time.
It's a slow trudge.
Exactly. So I've been doing that for a while, but you have to travel to the archive to do this.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not the only one who has a problem like this, of course. But it is rather annoying that I am able to find family trees for other people that go back to the 1500s, and I'm stuck with mine in the 1660s, where actually I should be able, knowing which records there are, to find something. But I just don't understand why I can't find a marriage record and I can't find a baptism for both of them. Now, over the years, I've seen some online trees appear, of course, where my Jacob is connected to a family. I've never seen proof of whether this is correct or not. And I think we all know that proof is what we need, because without any evidence, it's just a hypothesis. So if someone has a great idea where to look for my illustrious Jacob and Joan, then yes, please let me know.
And what's the best way for listeners to make contact if they think they have a clue or research idea?
They can go to my website, of course, which is antecedentia.com. And they can send me an email, which is research@antecedentia.com. Or just Google my name on internet, John Boeren and genealogy, and I think I will pop up everywhere. I'm also on Blue Sky, so if people want to reach out through social media, that's also an option.
And just before I wrap up this section, how are we spelling Jacob and Joan's names? What's the most consistent way you see them?
You really want to do this in Dutch?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, so it's in Latin because they were Catholics. So what I see in the Paris registers is Jacob or JACOBUS HENDRIKX.
Yep.
And her name in Dutch is JENNEKEN, HEIJLIGER, JANSSEN.
I will ask you after this episode to help me with the spelling of those. So listeners will be able to head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com, where they can read this episode's show notes and send us a message and read those spellings of those names that I'm not going to begin to pretend I can spell. Or they can just email us at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com and we'll pass the message along to John. Now, my fingers are tightly crossed in hope that listeners might be able to help you solve this. But in the meantime, I think I might just be able to help you with this. But you'll need to follow me through to the garage.
All right.
Well, here we are, my secret time machine.
Your secret what?
Time machine.
Yes, that's what you said, but really? It looks like a lot of junk.
Junk? I'll have you know that this is a fully functional, highly scientific piece of calibrated equipment.
I'm not sure.
Well, let me demonstrate it then. If you take a seat over there and let me know a date and place that might help solve your brick wall, then I'll zap you right back there in time.
Really, Andrew? Is this safe?
Well, I've not lost anyone yet.
That's not exactly a yes.
Oh, you'll be fine. No need to worry, John. Come on, get your bum on the seat and we'll get this started. You'll also need this temporal beacon. You just press that big button on the top when you're ready to come home again.
Okay.
Now, John, when and where would you like to go back to try and solve that puzzle for yourself?
Let's go back to HENDRIKX, who was baptized on the 15th of February, 1660, in Meerle, near Hoogstraten in Belgium.
Lovely. Let me get that all set. There we go. Sit tight and you'll soon be there.
You're not coming too?
Oh no, I'm just going to blast you back in time. I'm staying right here.
What?
Speaking of which, John Boeren, thank you, goodbye, and good luck. Cheddar in Somerset, England? Oh, well, it's his fault. He mentioned cheese. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant John Boeren, and if you've enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to tap the follow button, or whatever it's called in your app, to make sure you get the next one as soon as it's released. Thank you for listening. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.